The envelope had been sitting on Harold Mercer's kitchen table for 3 days before he opened it, not because he'd forgotten about it. Harold Mercer did not forget things. He had noticed it the moment his housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, set it beside his coffee cup on Thursday morning. Cream-colored, heavyweight stock, the kind that announced its own importance before you'd read a single word. He had noticed the return address embossed in gold on the back flap. He had noticed, too, the deliberateness of it, the way it had been sent not to this modest brick house on Elgin Street, but to the administrative offices of Mercer Watershed Holdings on Bay Street, and then rerouted here by his assistant, Gerald, with a small sticky note that read only, "Personal." He left it there. He drank his coffee. He read the Globe and Mail. He went to work in his gray Volvo that had 140,000 kilometers on it and a small crack in the passenger side mirror that he kept meaning to have fixed. On Sunday morning, he opened it. Inside was a wedding invitation. Thomas Aldridge and Brenda Cahill, printed in that same gold ink, requesting the pleasure of his company at their nuptials at the Rideau Valley Golf and Country Club, 3rd Saturday of September. Below the formal text in Brenda's handwriting, he recognized it immediately. Even after 9 years, a single handwritten line had been added. "I thought you should see what you missed out on." Harold set the card down on the kitchen table. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the maple in the backyard, which was just beginning to turn at the edges, the way maples do in Ontario in late August, orange creeping in from the outside in. He thought about that line for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Gerald. "I need you to clear the 3rd Saturday of September," he said. "That's the Algonquin board retreat," Gerald said. "Reschedule it." A pause. Gerald had worked for Harold for 11 years and had learned, across those 11 years, that pauses were permitted, but follow-up questions were to be deployed carefully. "Should I ask?" "No," Harold said, and Gerald, pull out the dark suit, the one from Samuel Sorensen, and call Forsyth. There was a longer pause this time. Gerald knew what calling Forsyth meant. "All right," he said simply. Harold hung up and looked at the invitation again. He did not feel what Brenda had perhaps imagined he would feel. The sting of it. The small cruelty she'd intended to deliver with that handwritten line. The way she'd wanted him to picture her in white with Thomas Aldridge of the Aldridge Development Group, successful and golden and certain of herself. He did not feel wounded. He felt, if he was honest, something quieter than that, something closer to sad, but not for himself. He had met Brenda Cahill in 2015 at a fundraising dinner for the Canadian Wildlife Federation, of all places. She had been 34 then, a project coordinator with a downtown firm, clever and quick and very sure of what she wanted. Harold had been 51, recently returned from 4 years working in northern British Columbia on watershed management initiatives that almost no one in a dinner jacket had heard of, and he'd been wearing a blazer that did not fit him especially well, because Gerald hadn't yet come into his life to manage such things. Brenda had been seated across from him and had spent the first 40 minutes of dinner making polite but clearly disinterested conversation, the way people do when they've already surveyed the room and decided where the evening's real opportunities lay. When she excused herself after dessert without asking for his card, Harold had not been surprised. He'd been surprised 2 weeks later when she called his office. She'd gotten the number through a colleague, she explained, to ask if he might be interested in consulting on a land use issue her firm was navigating. He'd said yes, that had been the beginning. They were together for 4 years. He had never quite understood, during those 4 years, why she stayed. He was not flashy. He did not take her to the sorts of places she clearly preferred. He drove the Volvo, lived in the Elgin Street house, wore the ill-fitting blazers, and then the better-fitting ones Gerald eventually procured. He worked in an industry most people found tedious when they were being polite and impenetrable when they weren't. He traveled frequently, the North, the Prairies, once 3 months in the Northwest Territories, and Brenda had stayed in Toronto and found his absences increasingly difficult to excuse to her friends. She had also, he understood in retrospect, never quite believed him when he described what he actually did for a living. She had heard water consulting, assembled from that phrase a modest professional income, and arranged her assessment of him accordingly. He had not corrected her. It was not, he told himself, deception. It was simply that he found the conversation tiresome, and he had always preferred to let people discover things at their own pace. In 2019, she left him for Thomas Aldridge. She did not say that was what was happening. She said she needed someone more present, more engaged with the world she lived in, someone who understood that a relationship required investment. She used that word in the specific way people do when they mean something both literal and metaphorical, and aren't quite prepared to admit the literal part. She had been, Harold thought, not dishonest exactly, just not entirely honest. He had wished her well. He had meant it. He had also, in the 2 years following, quietly completed the acquisition of 3 major water rights portfolios in northern Ontario and restructured Mercer Watershed Holdings in a way that had attracted the sort of attention that came with a profile in the Financial Post and a speaking invitation at Davos, both of which Gerald had managed and Harold had approached with his characteristic lack of enthusiasm for personal publicity. He had not reached out to Brenda to tell her any of this. He had not reached out to Brenda at all. And then the invitation arrived. The Rideau Valley Golf and Country Club sat on 38 acres south of Manotick, the kind of place that had a waiting list for membership and stone pillars at the entrance gate and staff who were trained to convey welcome while simultaneously conveying that welcome was conditional. Harold had been a member for 22 years, since before the renovation, since before the new clubhouse with its glass atrium overlooking the 14th green. He arrived 12 minutes after the ceremony was scheduled to begin. He arrived in the car that Forsyth had arranged, which was a black Cadillac Escalade, and there were 2 more behind it, not because Harold needed an entourage, but because 3 members of the Mercer Watershed Board had asked, after seeing his name on the guest list, if they might attend with him, and because Forsyth, whose job was to manage Harold's security and logistics on occasions when the scope of what Harold Mercer actually controlled became relevant, had decided 3 vehicles was appropriate. There were also, in the front passenger seat of Harold's vehicle and the driver's seat of the second, 2 men whose quiet professionalism had a quality that people in rooms tended to notice. The man at the valet stand noticed immediately. He spoke briefly into a radio. Harold stepped out of the vehicle. He was wearing the Samuelson suit, charcoal gray, and a tie that Gerald had selected, and that Harold had immediately loosened by half a centimeter in the car. He was not a tall man, not especially imposing. He was 60 years old and had the sort of face that suggested long distances and cold weather, and a great deal of time spent thinking about things that were not visible in the immediate surroundings. He stood for a moment on the flagstone entrance path and looked up at the clubhouse. He had played golf here twice in the last year and eaten lunch here perhaps 8 or 9 times. He knew the head groundskeeper by name, Derek Volum, who had taken the job 3 years ago from a club in Muskoka and who worried about the fairway drainage on holes 6 through 9 every spring without fail. Harold knew this because Harold paid attention to things that most people in his position considered beneath their attention. He walked in. The ceremony had already concluded. He had timed this deliberately, and the reception was gathering in the main hall and the adjacent terrace, that pre-dinner hour of champagne and photographs and the low, bright noise of 150 people who are happy for someone else, and also happy about the open bar. Harold was crossing the entrance foyer when a man stepped forward to intercept him. Thomas Aldridge was 58, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who had been athletic in his 30s and still carried himself as though that were recent and relevant. He was, Harold knew, 3rd-generation real estate development. His grandfather had built subdivisions in Mississauga. His father had built condominiums in North York. And Thomas had spent the last 25 years building things that were larger and more expensive and considerably more leveraged. He was not, in Harold's assessment, a bad man. He was a man who had spent his life in rooms where he was the most powerful person present, and this had given him a particular kind of confidence that did not always remain graceful under pressure. He was not graceful now. "Harold," he said, in a voice calibrated to be heard without quite carrying. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "Thomas," Harold said. Thomas glanced behind Harold, at Forsyth's man standing near the door, at the second vehicle visible through the glass, and then back. Something moved across his face. "I think there may have been some confusion about the invitation," he said. "I don't think Brenda intended. She intended exactly what she wrote," Harold said pleasantly. "She has very clear handwriting." Thomas's jaw set. "This isn't the kind of event where—" "Thomas!" Harold's voice was not loud. It was the sort of voice that did not need to be loud because it had learned, over 6 decades, That quiet and certain was considerably more effective than loud and anxious. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I was invited. I'll have a drink, offer my congratulations when the moment is right, and leave before dinner. Thomas studied him for a moment. I'd prefer if you didn't stay at all. Harold considered this. I imagine you would, he said, and moved past him into the hall. The room was everything the Rideau Valley Club knew how to do. White dahlias and trailing greenery, tables clothed in ivory linen, the late afternoon light dropping golden through the atrium glass and gilding everything it touched. It was beautiful, Harold thought, in an achieved and deliberate way. Someone had spent a great deal of money making it look effortless. He took a glass of champagne from a passing server, sparkling water, actually. He hadn't drunk champagne in years, and stood near the windows that overlooked the 14th green, and he waited. He was aware, with peripheral precision, of how the room adjusted to his presence. Not all at once. One or two people recognized him first. He saw Colin Pemberton, who sat on the board of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, do a brief double-take from across the room, and then say something to the woman beside him. Then someone else noticed. And then the particular low-frequency shift that happens in rooms when the weight of recognition begins to move through them, person by person, like a slow current. Harold had experienced this before. He found it neither gratifying nor uncomfortable. It was simply a fact of what he had become, the way the Volvo and the Elgin Street house were facts, and the Samuels' soon suit on occasion, and the 3 vehicles in the parking lot. He was looking out at the 14th green, thinking about the drainage issue Derek Volum had mentioned last spring when Brenda found him. He heard her before he saw her. The particular rhythm of her heels on the parquet floor, quick and then slowed, the sound of someone who has spotted something they did not expect and whose body has not yet agreed on how to proceed. Brenda Cahill. Brenda Aldridge, as of approximately 90 minutes ago, was 50 years old and looked, Harold thought, genuinely lovely. The dress was ivory silk, simple and expensive, and she was holding a small bouquet of white garden roses that she had perhaps forgotten she was holding. Her hair was the same dark auburn he remembered, and her eyes were the same clear green, and she was looking at him with an expression he found difficult to name. Not quite the triumphant one she had perhaps planned for, not quite the composed one she had probably rehearsed. "Harold," she said. "Brenda." He turned fully from the window. "Congratulations, it's a beautiful wedding." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the windows and then back. "I didn't think you'd actually come," she said. It was the second time he'd heard that phrase this afternoon. "You sent an invitation," he said simply. "I sent a—" She stopped. Somewhere behind her, a photographer was quietly materializing, with the patient instinct of someone whose entire professional skill lies in anticipating moments that are about to become significant. Brenda seemed to become aware of the room around her in a new way. She lowered her voice. "The note, unkind," Harold said, without heat. "Yes, I noticed." The color in her face changed slightly. He had always been able to do that, not through cruelty, but through precision. The ability to name things accurately in a quiet voice had always been for Harold more than sufficient. "Why did you come?" she said. He thought about the maple in his backyard, the way the color moves from the outside in. "Because you invited me," he said, "and because I thought it was important for you to know that I'm fine, Brenda. I want you to know that." He paused. "I genuinely hope you are too." She stared at him. Her hands had tightened slightly on the garden roses. Somewhere behind her, Colin Pemberton was speaking to another man. Jeffrey Horn, Harold thought, who chaired the Eastern Ontario Development Authority. And both of them were looking in Harold's direction, with expressions that suggested the conversation was, at least in part, about him. "What are all these people doing here?" Brenda said quietly. Her voice had changed. There was something careful in it now, careful and slightly unsteady. "I've had 4 people come up to me in the last 10 minutes asking if I know you, asking if it's true that you're—" She stopped. Harold waited. "Colin Pemberton just told Thomas," she said, "that you control more freshwater infrastructure in northern Ontario than the provincial government does." "Colin tends toward overstatement," Harold said, "but he's not entirely wrong." The garden roses were very still in her hands. "You never told me," she said. "You never asked," he said, and he said it without accusation, without the satisfaction she might have expected and perhaps had hoped to deny him. "You formed an impression and I let you keep it. That was my error, Brenda. I should have been clearer with you. I'm sorry for that." She looked at him for a long time. He watched the thing she had planned, the small triumph of that handwritten note, the image of him receiving it and feeling diminished. He watched it rearrange itself into something else, something she would be sorting through long after today. "I should get back to my guests," she said finally. "Of course," he said. "It's your wedding." He watched her go. She moved back into the golden light of the room, back toward Thomas, who was speaking to someone near the bar with a forced, careful smile. She did not look back. Harold set his glass of sparkling water on a nearby tray. He spent the next 20 minutes doing the thing he had actually come to do, which was speak to Jeffrey Horn about the Eastern Ontario water table assessment that had stalled in committee for 3 months, and then briefly to Colin Pemberton about the Chamber's infrastructure working group, and then to a woman named Patricia Lask, who turned out to be the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources, and who had apparently also been trying, through 3 different intermediaries, to get a meeting with Harold for the better part of a year. He gave her Gerald's card. He was heading back through the entrance foyer when he became aware that Thomas Aldridge was following him. Harold. Thomas caught up near the coat check. His composure had frayed somewhat across the afternoon, the way composure does when a room has spent 2 hours quietly reorganizing its understanding of who exactly is the most significant person present. "I need to understand what you were doing in there." Harold looked at him. "I was attending a wedding to which I was invited." "You were." Thomas stopped, collected himself, tried again. "You spoke to Jeffrey Horn for 20 minutes. I did. He chairs the Eastern Ontario Development Authority." "He does." Thomas looked at him steadily. "The Rideau Corridor development approvals have been stalled for 8 months, he said. Aldridge Development has 3 projects pending those approvals." Harold said nothing. "Were you?" Thomas seemed, for the first time, genuinely uncertain of how to proceed. "Was that a coincidence? That you spoke to him today?" Harold considered the question with apparent seriousness. "Jeffrey and I have been trying to connect for some time," he said. "It was convenient, Thomas repeated. "Thomas." Harold's voice was, as it had been all afternoon, measured and mild. "I came to your wedding, I congratulated you, and I had several productive conversations that had nothing to do with you. I'll be gone in 2 minutes and your guests will have a lovely evening." He buttoned his jacket. "Your drainage on 16 is going to be a problem this autumn, by the way. Derek knows it. You should have that conversation with the grounds committee before October." He walked out through the stone pillars and into the warm September evening. Forsyth's man opened the car door. Harold got in. The door closed. Through the tinted glass he could see Thomas Aldridge still standing at the entrance. Not angry, quite, not wounded, but with the look of a man who has just realized that the room he thought he was the most important person in had been quietly, thoroughly rearranged around him. The 3 vehicles moved in a smooth line down the long drive, past the stone pillars, and out onto the county road. Harold loosened his tie the rest of the way and looked out at the fields going by, the late September Ontario light going amber across the pasture on his left. Someone had put cattle out late this year. He noticed that. His phone showed a message from Gerald. Patricia Lask's office called. "She'd like to set a meeting." "Said you'd understand," he replied. "Tuesday works. Morning." Then he put the phone face down on the seat beside him and watched the fields until the fields became the highway, and then watched the highway until the highway became the city, and then watched the city come up around him, all its familiar weight and brightness, and thought about nothing in particular. He thought about whether Derek Volum would get around to the fairway drainage before the first frost. He thought that he probably would. Derek was conscientious about that kind of thing. The Volvo was waiting in his driveway on Elgin Street when he got home. He stood beside it for a moment in the evening air, his jacket over his arm, before going inside. Mrs. Finch had left supper in the oven. The maple in the backyard had turned another degree further overnight. More orange now than green, the color moving steadily inward. Harold Mercer stood at the kitchen window and watched it for a while. Then he sat down, ate his supper, and went to bed at a reasonable hour the way he always did.